Hello and welcome to today's debates about changes in UK and EU data protection legislation, as well as how it will impact big data scenarios and international transfers of personal data. My name is Tudor Galos. I'm a privacy consultant running a consultancy company with over 150 customers in US, UK, EU, and Turkey. And together with me, we have Marco Barone, who is a privacy counsel here in London at the famous company OneTrust. Hello, welcome, Marco.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining.
Marco, tell us about yourself. What are you doing exactly at OneTrust, and what else is OneTrust doing?
So hopefully many of you will know OneTrust, not just because it's the main sponsor on the lanyard, but because it's a worldwide leader for delivering its trust intelligence platform, software operationalizing privacy, data protection, data governance, but also security and GRC, data ethics, and ESG. So my role at OneTrust is supporting the company for compliance-related matters internally within our privacy program, but also helping the company in fostering its product-related features specifically for privacy.
Thank you very much. So let's start now with the politics. Well, when we designed this session, the data protection bill was a really hot subject. Well, nowadays it has been announced as a dropped project by the UK government. What are your thoughts on this change of direction? Is this good news or even more uncertainty?
Thanks, Tudor. Yes. Well, we have seen so many passages throughout the year for the UK data bill. Specifically, we have seen at the end of the last year, the DCMS, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports, proposing this new direction for the data privacy reform. And this consultation process ended toward June this year and led us to see that UK data bill, the 143, that proposed some reforms. Within the context, we have seen some proposals, for example, reducing burdens on companies taking over from the GDPR, from the UK GDPR, without necessarily overturning the principles within the GDPR. Unfortunately, this bill has been paused as of now, so we don't know exactly what will be the direction, but it will likely be keeping the UK GDPR standards, the broader EU GDPR standards, and trying to foster some more features, some more direction within this standard.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting that the bill was dropped, although it was part of the strategy of the Information Commissioner Office of the ICO, which is the regulator in UK. But also it launched a consultation, ICO 25, on what it wants to achieve by 2025. Well, so what's your initial thoughts on ICO's vision?
Well, it's really interesting because one of the points of the UK data strategy and the UK data bill that it has been shelved was the UK ICO reform. So there are some similarities between the reform and the ICO vision itself. Primarily, for example, enabling the ICO with more powers for enforcement and for guidance toward businesses. The ICO in its ICO 25 plan for the next 4 years was spotlighting how businesses are facing lots of uncertainty for the enforcement actions. And so it's really interesting to see empowering the ICO, the Information Commissioner Office, toward having more capabilities and providing more guidance to businesses. And this is specifically valid, and that is something I've really looked into for data transfers and data flows. So if you take a look at if you consider the broader vision from the ICO and from the UK data reform, we can see that there is a very effective approach. There is a very broad interest in ensuring not just the theoretical consideration around data flows, international data flows, but also considering like the realistic approach on companies relying on big data, huge data lakes, and potentially infinite sub-processing chain throughout the processing chain.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. By the way, you can ask questions as well. Just raise your hands, ask your questions. I repeat in order to be heard also on TV. And Marco or myself will answer. So any question, just raise your hand anytime during this.
Absolutely.
How many of you are from startups here? Okay, quite a few. People from startups don't usually have the resources to hire consultants or specialists, especially for their complicated scenarios in big data scenarios. What should be the first steps they should take in order to stay on top of all these changes? Because only in UK we have this change with ICO, but if you are looking at EU and US, it's becoming a nightmare.
That's a really good point. And actually it ties in with what we were saying about the UK reform, and also about OneTrust can help addressing these concerns. The UK reform, as far as I've gathered from talking to colleagues and other peers in the industry, was a great opportunity, and it will be for sure a great opportunity for small, medium enterprises, for startups, specifically UK-based, to overcome some of the burdens that the GDPR was setting on them. And so, for example, let's say if we mention the DPO appointment, the UK bill was ruling out the need for appointing a DPO, or also the need for a record of processing activity. So all these burdens that were seen as bureaucratic burdens, specifically from small medium enterprises, and OneTrust can actively help in that direction, for example, with its data guidance platform, in keeping on top of all these changes and constantly monitoring with a team of analysts that constantly screens through the regulatory landscape to be on top of all these issues.
Thank you very much. Now let's talk about a little bit international transfers. Last year, European Commission published the so-called standard contractual clauses for transfer of personal data outside of the EU if other adequacy mechanisms were unavailable, such as adequacy decisions. UK issued its own document called International Data Transfer Agreements, IDTAs, again for situations where there was no adequacy decision. Now, many companies, based on our experience, didn't understand this movement at all. Even if when we had an adequacy, we have an adequacy decision between UK and EU, and still some companies want EU companies to sign IDTAs because they think they make an export. So if big companies don't understand, what chances do small companies have, and what resources should they look into in order to tackle this issue, especially in big data scenarios where you constantly use multi-geographical data?
So this is a challenge that at OneTrust we are constantly facing, because realistically, as we were saying, you have to be able to consider a long sub-processing chain, especially in big data scenarios. So multiple data lakes that are scattered all over the globe, and you have to be able to address all concerns around data transfers contractually, technically, and from an organizational perspective. With that being said, there are a few points to mention here, because, of course, the SCCs you were mentioning are still the most relied, the most helpful tool for companies to perform data transfer, alongside the transfer impact assessment. So adopting a, let's say, a risk-based approach in the UK is certainly a good approach to address all these concerns. Sometimes companies might not have all the tools for addressing these concerns. And so it's really helpful to rely, for example, on tools like OneTrust for performing all these operations in an automatized way. For example, we have our own TIA tool, and from a compliance standpoint, we are primarily facing all these concerns. So collaborating with companies like our sub-processor, let's say, for example, Cloudflare, we have a strong collaboration with Cloudflare. Recently, we implemented a data residency strategy, or data residency feature that enables company to keep data within the European region borders so that they will not see data trespassing toward other countries. And that's really appreciated from European customers.
Good. And whilst staying on this discussion of international transfers, what do you think? How is the UK now that we have IDTA, which is, by the way, much simpler than the equivalent in EU, the so-called standard contractual clause? It's simpler. How do you think UK in the next bill, because clearly at some point UK GDPR will be replaced by new legislation, what changes do you think ICO will focus on the new bill in terms of international transfers?
Yeah, so we can basically infer that from the current consultation paper and from the current bill that we have seen so far, and the approach that the government was proposing and the ICO is supporting is, again, a very effective and realistic approach toward data transfer. So myself at OneTrust, I have dealt personally with the implementation, with the phasing, how to combine the current approach for the international data transfer agreement and addendum you were mentioning. And lots of customers are keen on learning more about how this really affects all the measures in place and how to enable data transfer. In terms of the data bill itself, we have seen that there are some changes, but not so major changes. So, for example, the bill was talking about a data protection test instead of a transfer impact assessment. And that would basically end up in a very similar approach, but we can expect more guidance from the ICO in that direction. Again, the ICO is very keen on providing guidance, on providing certainty on how to enforce specifically data transfer, but all the parts of data protection. So we'll certainly see more in the next few months or hopefully years.
Let's touch on another hot subject, data localization. We've seen it more and more addressed. It started with the new China regulation of processing personal data. It's extremely difficult, trust me, to export data from China. EU, with its tough regulations in terms of data exports, on the fact that the data controller needs to perform an analysis and do a transfer impact assessment for every personal data transfer. UK, the same, and now more and more countries are adopting really tough regulations in terms of data transfers. How should big data companies approach this? What should they do? Should they replicate? Should they create servers in each country where they operate and fill them with local personal data or local data? It's a nightmare.
It's an interesting challenge. And just a few days ago, I was taking a look at the papers, all the data sheet that the European Commission is providing for its digital strategy. And we are seeing that there is a huge shift from a centralized approach for data storage, for data lakes, toward a more decentralized approach where there will be many devices interconnected, exchanging data. We have already seen that with the development of the peer-to-peer networks, DLTs, distributed ledger technologies, and blockchains. And of course, it's a trend that will increase more and more in future. So realistically, there will be a huge increase in the data-driven economy, and in a direct proportional way in data flows worldwide. So companies have to be aware of how to localize data, but also how to address effectively data transfers. And again, for example, something that I've been tackling at OneTrust is how to help customers in localize their hosting location. So I was mentioning the collaboration with Cloudflare, but we also have the capability to host regionally servers relying on Azure or other sub-processor to allow companies not to have necessarily a centralized data lake, a centralized data storage location. So they will be able to rely on the closest server based on their location.
Thank you very much. And since we are talking about change, what would you change at the GDPR, both EU and UK? Because at this point they look kind of the same. What change would you, Marco Barone, do to the legislation if you were in Brussels or here in London and propose a new legislation? How would you change it?
That's a really interesting and tough question. I would say that, well, we have seen the 4th birthday of the GDPR now since it came into force, and it's still a global standard, so it's still very valid, and we have seen lots of regulations across the globe taking inspiration from the GDPR, from China with the PIPL to Brazil with the LGPD. There are some challenges, and of course it's becoming outdated. I don't know, many of you have been following the Libe committee proposals on how to overhaul the GDPR provisions, on how to improve the stance, for example, in terms of big data and data transfers. But there is lots ongoing. And from my perspective, I wish to see some changes to keep up with the pace, to keep up with all the new challenges, technological challenges from DLTs, so many distributed devices, IoT, how to approach also roles and responsibility in the light of a distributed controllership, for example. So that would be all challenges that the regulator will soon have to tackle. And last but not least, the Packer regulation. So how to tackle cookies and tracking technologies, and how to align standards with the GDPR.
Good. And if you are talking about data strategy, we've seen a glimpse of how EU is thinking about it. And they are delivering the so-called package, which is a complex set of regulations. Now we have out for consultation on in the process of voting. We have Data Act, Data Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Data Governance Act, Open Data Directive, Free Flow of Data Regulation, and we have the e-privacy, which is in discussion for more than 6 or 7 years. How should people stay ahead of these regulations, at least to understand what is the strategy? Because clearly there are some simple facts in all these regulations, such as, okay, don't block access to data, don't act as a data blocker, think about data stewardship, think about how to share data for the common good, and so on. What are the top 3 or top 10, top 5 things that people should think about these regulations?
That's another good point. We were talking about how to reform, how to improve the GDPR, and actually the whole digital strategy from the European Commission is considering a broader scenario. So all the acts you were mentioning, all the regulations are part of a broader and holistic approach on how to be the leader in terms of digital transformation, in terms of data-driven economy. And that's something that is already happening. We have seen, for example, the AI Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, that has lots of similarities with the GDPR, and it's trying to set another big standard for automated decision making and artificial intelligence. So that is something that we'll see more and more in time. Broadly speaking, we should probably consider a few points, because these all tie together in terms of data strategy, so part of the European Commission data strategy on how to improve and leverage data. And we are not talking just about personal data, but as you were mentioning even in your previous talk, we are talking about personal data and non-personal data, and it's really interesting to see the border between personal and non-personal data, specifically in big data scenarios and in global companies facing this challenging on what's the applicable regulation. So data, considering data, but also considering competition law, of course, antitrust law, in terms of digital perspective. So we have seen the DMA and DSA, the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act, that will be a huge component of this whole strategy. We will see the addressing more specifically competition and repurposing of data, the Data Act that has been proposed this year as a draft, and the Data Governance Act that was enacted this year. So there are lots of things going on that will certainly create a more holistic approach for businesses to tackle all these digital challenges.
Also, it's very interesting that not only the EU issued such strategy papers, but also UK issued even an AI strategy, which is a really good document. So now we have a vision coming from the authorities finally trying to understand what AI is. Of course, there are a lot of things to be corrected in these papers, but what should companies do? Should they read it? Should they involve? Should they work with the government? Because this is what public consultation means. It's really funny that a lot of times these authorities are publishing these documents and only 2-3 specialists are answering, but not the markets. And I would like the market to be involved and discuss with politicians, because this is the only opportunity that everyone has to provide the feedback. What do you think? What should companies do in terms of these papers?
So it's a big challenge, and I feel like the UK government, the UK strategy will be really aligned again with the broader European Commission, European Union strategy in terms of how to thrive in an even always more and more automated scenario when we rely on AI tools, on AI based companies and so on. So, for example, from what you can gather from the ICO 25 strategy, and it's something that has also been taken into account by the government itself in its proposal, is how to effectively tackle all challenges for AI, targeting, for example, vulnerable groups, or creating discrimination. So there will be an approach that will be certainly human-centric, enabling, for example, some sort of DPIA, the Data Protection Impact Assessment, but for specifically in light of AI, so something like an AI impact assessment. And of course, broadly speaking, adopting a risk-based approach toward the whole automated decision-making thread.
Yes, and what I really like about this regulation is that at least there is a promise to force big data players to open up their data spaces. For example, if we have now with the explosion of IoTs, and now with the processing moving more to the IoTs than from the cloud to the IoTs, many of these IoTs will produce tons of personal data, and in the end of data, which is locked by the manufacturer. I mean, if you want to, for example, if your car issue some messages. You cannot contact, I don't know, repairman to diagnose it remotely. You need to contact the company producing the car. The same, let's say, if you have an intelligent washing machine, or if you have a robot in a company, if you want to send that data to an analytical expert to improve the behavior of the robot, you cannot. At this moment, you can only contact the producer, and this will unlock a lot of opportunities. Before moving to conclusions, do we have any questions from you? Now is the time. Or later, contact us on LinkedIn. It's okay. When we are talking about the conclusion, what do you think are the top 5 things a big data company or people working in a big data company should do in terms of anticipating changes? Because these people are creating the future. Okay, we are creating the future applications, innovation, machine learning, AI, and so on. What should they pay attention to?
Well, we have talked a lot about data flows. So certainly one of the first challenges would be, before even considering how to address the international transfer, be aware of where data reside in the company. Because we said that basically big data scenarios, companies relying on multiple sub-processors will have lots of data scattered, not just within the company itself, but also with processors, and other companies that they rely on. So, for example, OneTrust provides lots of tools for data governance, to map data, to be aware of where data resides, the data mapping solution, the data governance, so the data discovery solution to automatize this process and integrate the platform with other proprietary solutions to directly discover data and possibly delete data. We were talking about anonymization in the previous chat, so that's a really good point to consider. After that, of course, being aware of the sub-processing chain, so addressing any third-party risks in the processing chain, and that again it can be done in multiple ways. We have lots of tools that enable third-party risk management, for example, and also policy management. So enabling that you are aware of how to conduct an audit periodically on vendors and third parties in general. One third point, I would say, ties back to what we were talking about, data deletion. Since you rely on multiple sources, and I myself have been working with several big companies, for example, in the financial sector, relying on very big data lakes, and it's always a challenge, not just from a technical perspective, but even in terms of energies, monies, and whatever. So it's really important to rely on tools, on processes that can automatize this strategy and can help companies to really effectively delete data when it's necessary, balance data retention requirements, and use data appropriately whenever there is the possibility, for example, to anonymize data.
Good. Thank you very much. I will finish by asking you to get involved. So if you see acts or laws coming from UK or EU governments, especially if you do business with the EU, in public consultation, provide feedback. If you see rubbish there, and usually you will see rubbish there, just provide feedback. In the AI Act, in the EU, we saw a thing and we provided feedback on it, that the definition of AI, most software pieces in this world were fitting to that definition. So almost everything could have been called AI. And asking a company, for example, to perform a data protection impact assessment on any software, it's unfeasible. So Just make sure you read them through. If it's not understandable, then there is a problem. So do get involved. Second of all, yes, try to do the basic thing in terms of privacy compliance, because what's in the UK GDPR and EU GDPR will be soon throughout the world. It will be simplified, but the principles remain absolutely the same. Nothing will change in the principles. And third, get connected. Get connected with yourself, get connected with us, connect with us on LinkedIn, and let's keep the conversation alive. Thank you very much for joining. Have a great session today.
Thank you.